Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
The intake form sitting on my desk was completed in my handwriting, signed with my credentials. Documenting a patient interview I had absolutely no memory of conducting, yet every detail felt intimately familiar, as if I'd written it in a dream I couldn't quite remember. I am Marcus Johnson, licensed clinical social worker, and for the past 7 years I have served as Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital's primary intake specialist. My office, tucked into the east wing between the main lobby and the patient floors, processes the initial contact between crisis and care. Every person who enters this facility for psychiatric treatment passes through my assessment process first. The work requires a particular temperament, equal parts empathy and clinical detachment. I interview individuals in their most vulnerable moments, translating raw human suffering into the standardized language of mental health diagnosis. My office walls are lined with filing cabinets containing over 3,000 intake assessments, each representing someone's darkest hour transformed into actionable treatment data. My intake protocol never varies. First, the preliminary paperwork, insurance verification, emergency contacts, basic demographic information. Then the clinical interview itself, conducted using the structured clinical interview for DSM-5 disorders. I take detailed notes by hand, a practice that predates electronic records and one I've never abandoned. The handwritten assessment creates a more personal connection with the patient's narrative than typing into a computer screen. Each completed intake file follows the same organizational structure. Demographics on top, insurance forms in the middle, my handwritten clinical notes at the bottom, all secured with a standard paperclip in the upper left corner. After completion, files are immediately entered into our electronic system and physically stored in designated filing cabinets organized by admission date. On Tuesday morning, October 15th, I arrived to find a completed intake file on my desk. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes I work late and leave files for electronic entry the following morning. But as I reviewed the paperwork, I realized I had no memory of conducting this particular assessment. The patient name was listed as M. Henderson, admitted for evaluation of severe depression with psychotic features. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. I recognized my characteristic method of forming certain letters, the way I abbreviated common clinical terms, even my tendency to press harder with the pen when writing particularly significant observations. Yet I had no recollection of meeting Monsieur Henderson. The clinical notes described a patient who'd been found wandering downtown in a dissociative state, brought in by police after concerned citizens reported someone talking to invisible companions. The individual had been lucid during intake, providing coherent responses to my standard questions while maintaining that the other people were still present in the room with us. What disturbed me most wasn't the content of the notes, but their intimate detail. I documented specific physical mannerisms, quoted exact phrases from our conversation, noted subtle behavioral observations that could only come from direct personal interaction. The assessment read like the work of someone who'd spent considerable time with this patient, developing the kind of clinical rapport that requires careful cultivation. I checked our electronic admission system. No record of M. Henderson appeared in any database. I contacted the night security staff who would have processed any police-initiated admissions. They had no record of anyone being brought in by law enforcement in the past week. Yet the intake form contained a police report number that, when I called to verify, didn't exist in their system either. Over the following days, I began finding additional files I couldn't remember creating. Each followed my exact documentation style, contained my authentic handwriting, and described patients with conditions that fell well within my area of expertise. Yet these individuals seemed to exist only within my filing system, documented nowhere else in the hospital's comprehensive records. The cases themselves were fascinating from a clinical perspective. M. Henderson's assessment described auditory and visual hallucinations that followed recognizable patterns of psychotic disorders but with unusual consistency and detail that suggested something beyond typical psychiatric presentation. Another file, for K. Williams, documented a patient who claimed to be receiving treatment at Millbrook in 1987. Despite appearing to be no older than 35, I started staying late to review these mysterious files more carefully. The clinical notes revealed a disturbing pattern. Each patient had been admitted with complaints directly related to the hospital itself. They reported seeing staff members who died years earlier, receiving treatment in rooms that had been demolished during renovations, participating in therapy programs that had been discontinued decades ago. As I delved deeper into these impossible cases, I realized that my handwriting in these files was evolving. The earlier mysterious assessments matched my current documentation style perfectly, but the more recent ones showed subtle changes, slightly different letter formations, varying pen pressure, small stylistic variations that suggested someone else was learning to replicate my writing. The breakthrough came when I discovered that the mysterious intake files were appearing in chronological order, corresponding to significant dates in the hospital's history. M. Henderson's admission date matched the anniversary of Millbrook's first psychiatric fatality in 1924. K. Williams' file appeared on the date of the hospital's major fire in 1987. Each impossible patient seemed connected to some traumatic event in the institution's past. I began researching the hospital's archives, looking for any connection between these mysterious patients and actual historical events. What I found challenged everything I understood about the nature of psychiatric assessment and the boundaries between clinical documentation and institutional memory. The names on my impossible intake files weren't random. They were variations of real patients who'd been treated at Millbrook during particularly tragic periods in the hospital's history. M. Henderson had been Mary Henderson, who died during experimental treatment in 1924. K. Williams was Karen Williams, who perished in the 1987 fire while waiting for discharge. But the most disturbing discovery was that my handwriting samples from these mysterious files, when compared with archived intake assessments from previous decades, showed remarkable similarity to documentation styles used by my predecessors. It was as if the role of intake specialist carried with it some kind of inherited responsibility to continue documenting cases that transcended the normal boundaries of admission and discharge. Realized that some patients never truly complete the intake process. Their initial assessments remain perpetually active, requiring ongoing documentation by whoever occupies the intake specialist position. The files I couldn't remember creating were part of a continuous assessment process that extended across decades, maintained by each successive intake specialist who'd inherited this office and its responsibilities. My final day in this position is tomorrow. I've accepted a transfer to outpatient services, hoping that a change of environment might break whatever connection has developed between my professional identity and these impossible cases. But as I prepare to hand over my files to my replacement, I wonder if the mysterious assessments will continue appearing on the intake specialist's desk, requiring documentation in handwriting that becomes more familiar with each impossible patient evaluated. Some intake assessments are never truly completed, and some specialists never finish their documentation responsibilities, even after they've moved on to other positions. The files suggest that patient evaluation at Millbrook operates according to principles that extend far beyond conventional clinical practice. Documentation creates its own reality, and sometimes the most important assessments are the ones we have no memory of conducting. The intake process, it seems, continues long after both patient and specialist have moved on to their next assignments. I opened my notebook to review yesterday's session notes for patient M, only to find pages filled with detailed observations written in handwriting that looked like mine. From 20 years in the future, describing therapeutic insights I had never developed and treatment approaches I had never learned. My name is Dr. Elena Blackwood, and I am completing my 4th year of psychiatric residency at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Unlike many of my colleagues who rely primarily on electronic health records, I maintain detailed handwritten notes in a leather-bound journal that has become essential to my clinical practice. The act of writing by hand helps me process complex therapeutic interactions and develop deeper insights into my patients' conditions. My notebook contains meticulous documentation of every patient encounter, organized chronologically with clear section breaks between different cases. Each entry includes the date, patient identifier, session duration, key therapeutic themes discussed, medication considerations, and my clinical impressions. Over 3.5 years, I have filled 4 identical notebooks with this careful documentation. Patient M first appeared on my caseload 8 weeks ago, referred for individual psychotherapy to address treatment-resistant anxiety with dissociative features. The initial consultation proceeded normally. I documented their presenting concerns, conducted a thorough psychiatric history, and established preliminary treatment goals. My notes from that first session filled 3 pages with detailed observations about their interpersonal style, defensive mechanisms, and potential therapeutic approaches. The following week, when I opened my notebook to review those initial notes before our second session, I discovered that they had been supplemented with additional observations written in my handwriting. These additions provided insights into patient M's unconscious motivations and suggested therapeutic interventions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychodynamic principles. The writing style matched my own, yet the content reflected a level of clinical sophistication that exceeded my current training. Initially, I assumed I had made these additional notes after further reflection and simply forgotten the process. Residency training involves processing enormous amounts of clinical information, and memory gaps regarding specific documentation weren't unusual. However, as the weeks progressed, I began finding entire sections of notes that I had no memory of writing. The supplemental notes demonstrated remarkable clinical insight. They identified therapeutic patterns I hadn't recognized, predicted patient M's responses to interventions I hadn't yet attempted, and suggested treatment modifications that proved remarkably effective when I implemented them. It was as if someone with years of additional training was collaborating on patient M's care, using my notebook as a medium for consultation. By the 6th week, the mysterious additions to my notes had evolved into complete session summaries for therapy meetings I couldn't remember conducting. These phantom sessions were documented in extraordinary detail, describing therapeutic breakthroughs and clinical insights that seemed to represent months of intensive work compressed into encounters that had never occurred on my actual schedule. The phantom session notes described a version of patient M who was making remarkable therapeutic progress, developing self-awareness and emotional regulation skills that typically required years of treatment to achieve. According to these impossible notes, we had explored childhood trauma, processed complex grief, and developed sophisticated coping mechanisms through work that existed only in my notebook. What disturbed me most was that the handwriting in these phantom sessions was gradually changing. The early mysterious additions matched my current writing style perfectly, but the more recent entries showed subtle variations, slightly different letter formations, varying pen pressure, and stylistic elements that suggested handwriting that had evolved over years of additional experience. I began comparing these evolving notes with samples of my own handwriting from medical school and early residency. The phantom session notes appeared to represent a progression of my writing style, as if someone was documenting what my handwriting might look like after decades of clinical practice. The most recent entries resembled what I imagined my notes might look like if I continued writing them for another 20 years. The breakthrough came when I realized that the phantom sessions described therapeutic work that I desperately wanted to accomplish with patient M, but hadn't yet developed the skills to achieve. The mysterious notes represented not just advanced clinical insights, but specifically the kind of therapeutic relationship I hoped to develop as I gained more experience and training. I started researching the history of psychiatric residents who had worked with patient M in previous years. What I discovered challenged everything I understood about the nature of therapeutic documentation and the boundaries between clinical observation and professional development. Patient M had been assigned to psychiatric residents for over 15 years, always requiring individual psychotherapy for treatment-resistant anxiety with dissociative features. Each resident had maintained detailed handwritten notes during their treatment relationship, and according to archive documentation, each resident had reported finding supplemental notes in their handwriting that they couldn't remember writing. The pattern was always identical: initial normal documentation, followed by increasingly sophisticated additions that demonstrated advanced clinical skills, culminating in phantom session notes that described therapeutic work the resident had never actually conducted. Each resident's phantom notes showed the same evolution of handwriting style, as if their professional penmanship was aging decades during a single patient relationship. I realized that patient M served as a training case that transcended normal residency education. The therapeutic relationship somehow accelerated professional development, allowing residents to experience advanced clinical skills they hadn't yet acquired through conventional training. The phantom notes represented not memory gaps, but glimpses of the psychiatrist I might become after years of additional experience. As I approach the end of my residency and prepare to transition to independent practice, I understand that my relationship with patient M has been preparing me for clinical challenges I haven't yet encountered. The phantom sessions documented in my evolving handwriting represent therapeutic skills I will need in future cases, insights that will become essential to my development as a psychiatrist. My final entry about patient M is being written with handwriting that looks remarkably similar to the phantom notes that first appeared 8 weeks ago. I suspect that some therapeutic relationships exist primarily to train the therapist, and some patients serve as bridges between current clinical abilities and future professional competence. The notebook will accompany me to my new position, but I suspect the phantom notes will remain here at Millbrook, waiting to supplement the documentation of the next psychiatric resident who needs to glimpse their future clinical capabilities. Professional development sometimes requires teachers who exist in the spaces between current abilities and future competence. Some therapeutic relationships train the provider more thoroughly than any formal education program ever could. When I realized that the 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle in room C7 had been under construction for 6 months, with the same patient working on it during every session, I decided to count the pieces and discovered there were always exactly 999. No matter how many times I recounted, my name is Jennifer Walsh, and I have served as the primary occupational therapist at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 9 years. My role involves helping patients develop or recover the practical life skills that mental illness has compromised, everything from basic self-care routines to complex problem-solving abilities. The goal is always rehabilitation, restoring function, building confidence, and preparing individuals for successful reintegration into their daily lives. My therapy suite consists of 4 rooms, each designed for different types of therapeutic activities. Room C7 is specifically equipped for cognitive rehabilitation work, puzzles, board games, craft projects, and other activities that exercise memory, attention, and executive functioning skills. The room contains modular furniture that can be rearranged for individual or group sessions, along with cabinets full of therapeutic materials, organized by complexity level. Occupational therapy in a psychiatric setting requires careful attention to each patient's current functional level and therapeutic goals. A patient recovering from severe depression might begin with simple self-care tasks, organizing personal items, following basic hygiene routines, maintaining a structured daily schedule. Someone with cognitive impairment might work on attention and memory exercises, progressing from simple matching tasks to complex problem-solving activities. The jigsaw puzzle that has dominated room C7 for the past 6 months is a 1,000-piece landscape scene. A pastoral meadow with wildflowers, rolling hills, and a distant farmhouse. I selected this particular puzzle because landscape scenes provide multiple organizational strategies. Patients can work on sky sections, flower clusters, or architectural elements depending on their cognitive preferences and abilities. Patient R first began working on the puzzle in April, referred for occupational therapy to address cognitive deficits associated with treatment-resistant depression. Their initial assessment showed significant impairment in concentration, problem-solving, and task completion, all areas where puzzle work provides excellent therapeutic benefit. The puzzle seemed an ideal match for their functional level and therapeutic needs. During our first session, patient R demonstrated good puzzle-solving strategies, organizing pieces by color and pattern, working systematically from edges inward, maintaining focus for extended periods. Their approach suggested cognitive abilities that exceeded what their referral information indicated. I documented this discrepancy, noting that their puzzle performance suggested higher functioning than their general clinical presentation indicated. Over subsequent sessions, patient R continued working on the same puzzle with remarkable consistency. They arrived promptly for each appointment, took their usual seat at the workstation, and resumed work exactly where they had left off. The puzzle progressed steadily. Border completed by week 2, sky section finished by week 4, meadow flowers taking shape by week 6. But as weeks turned into months, I began to notice something unusual about the puzzle's completion rate. Despite patient R's consistent progress during each session, the overall puzzle never seemed to get closer to completion. Sections that appeared finished would require additional work the following week. Areas I remembered as completed would show gaps that needed to be filled. By the 3rd month, I started documenting the puzzle's progress with photographs taken at the end of each session. The images revealed a disturbing pattern. While patient R was clearly placing pieces correctly during our sessions, the puzzle's overall state remained relatively unchanged from week to week. It was as if the therapeutic work was being undone between sessions, maintaining the puzzle in a perpetual state of near completion. I began counting the pieces more carefully. A 1,000-piece puzzle should contain exactly 1,000 pieces, but every count yielded 999 pieces. I counted multiple times, organized pieces by color and pattern, even weighed the box to estimate piece count based on average piece mass. The result was always the same, 999 pieces present, with no indication of what had happened to the missing piece. The most disturbing realization came when I discovered that patient R's therapeutic goals were shifting to match the puzzle's perpetual incompletion. Instead of progressing toward discharge as their cognitive abilities improved, their treatment plan was being modified to maintain ongoing occupational therapy services. The puzzle work had become an end in itself rather than a means toward functional recovery. I researched patient R's treatment history and discovered that they had been receiving occupational therapy services at Millbrook for over 5 years, despite insurance authorizations that typically covered only short-term rehabilitation periods. Each annual review recommended continued services based on ongoing cognitive rehabilitation needs that never seemed to resolve despite consistent therapeutic engagement. The truth began to emerge when I found archived therapy notes from previous occupational therapists who had worked in room C7. Each had documented the same phenomenon: patients who worked diligently on therapeutic activities that never quite reached completion, maintaining indefinite treatment authorizations that justified continued services long past typical discharge timeframes. Patient R, I realized, wasn't an individual requiring cognitive rehabilitation, but rather a therapeutic requirement of room C7 itself. The endless puzzle represented the ongoing need for occupational therapy services at Millbrook, providing justification for maintaining the program through the presence of a patient who would never complete treatment because completion would eliminate the need for continued services. As I prepared to transition to a new position at an outpatient rehabilitation clinic, I understand that my replacement will inherit patient R and the eternal puzzle in room C7. The therapeutic relationship will continue. The puzzle will maintain its perpetual state of near completion, and the occupational therapy program will justify its continued existence through services that, by design, can never be completed. Some therapeutic activities are designed not to be finished, and some patients exist primarily to ensure that certain services remain available for those who might need them in the future. The puzzle in room C7 will always be missing one piece, and patient R will continue to search for it, ensuring that occupational therapy remains a permanent fixture at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Therapeutic progress sometimes serves purposes beyond individual patient recovery. Some activities are designed to continue indefinitely, ensuring that certain services remain available for future patients who will need them more desperately than any current case ever could. I stood in the hallway of 1247 Maple Street, holding a completed home assessment for apartment 3C, knowing I had spent 2 hours inside conducting a thorough evaluation. Yet according to the building superintendent, apartment 3C had been sealed and empty for 30 years. My name is Catherine Bell, and for 6 years I have worked as a psychiatric social worker, specializing in community-based mental health services. My primary responsibility involves conducting home visits for patients who require assessment and support in their residential environments. This work takes me into private spaces where mental illness intersects with daily living, where I must evaluate safety, assess functional capacity, and coordinate services that enable people to remain in their communities. Home visits require careful preparation and specific safety protocols. Before visiting any client, I review their clinical history, confirm the appointment, and notify my supervisor of my planned arrival and departure times. Each visit follows a structured assessment process: environmental evaluation, mental status examination, medication compliance review, and development of appropriate intervention plans. The referral for 1247 Maple Street. Apartment 3C arrived through standard channels 6 weeks ago. The client, listed as D. Morrison, required a home assessment for possible conservatorship proceedings due to deteriorating self-care and questionable decision-making capacity. The referral came from Dr. Harrison, a psychiatrist I had worked with on numerous previous cases, requesting evaluation of Mr. Morrison's ability to live independently. I scheduled the appointment according to my usual protocol, calling the provided phone number to arrange a convenient time for the assessment. The voice that answered was elderly but articulate, agreeing to meet on Tuesday afternoon at 2 p.m. The conversation was brief but cordial, with Mr. Morrison expressing willingness to participate in the evaluation process. The building at 1247 Maple Street was a typical urban apartment complex, 4 stories of red brick, built sometime in the 1940s, showing signs of age but well-maintained. The lobby directory listed residents for apartments 1A through 4B, but no listing for 3C appeared on the board. I assumed this was an oversight in the directory maintenance and proceeded to the 3rd floor. Apartment 3C was located at the end of the hallway, its door distinguished by peeling paint and a slightly different style of hardware than the other units. When I knocked, Mr. Morrison opened the door immediately, as if he had been waiting directly behind it. He was a thin, elderly man with carefully combed white hair and clothes that suggested attention to personal appearance, despite obvious financial limitations. The apartment interior was modest but clean. A studio layout with basic furniture, personal photographs arranged on available surfaces, and signs of someone maintaining independent living despite advancing age. Mr. Morrison moved slowly but confidently through the space, offering tea and apologizing for the apartment's condition, though it appeared perfectly adequate for independent living. The assessment proceeded normally for the first hour. Mr. Morrison answered questions clearly, demonstrated good orientation to time and place, and showed no signs of cognitive impairment that would justify conservatorship proceedings. He discussed his medical history coherently, showed appropriate medication management, and exhibited social skills that suggested successful community integration. However, as the assessment continued, I began noticing details that didn't align with conventional independent living. The refrigerator contained food items that appeared fresh, despite having expiration dates from the 1990s. Newspapers stacked near his reading chair were from various decades, all appearing equally recent. The telephone he had used to confirm our appointment was a rotary model that shouldn't have been compatible with modern phone service. When I asked Mr. Morrison about these inconsistencies, he responded as if my questions didn't make sense. From his perspective, the food was fresh, the newspapers current, and the telephone functioned normally. He seemed genuinely confused by my concerns about expiration dates and outdated technology, as if these concepts weren't relevant to his daily experience. The assessment concluded with my determination that Mr. Morrison demonstrated adequate capacity for independent living, and that conservatorship proceedings weren't justified based on observed functional abilities. I completed my documentation, scheduled a follow-up visit for the following month, and left the apartment with standard pleasantries about seeing him again soon. When I reached the lobby, I encountered the building superintendent, who was checking tenant mailboxes. I mentioned my visit to apartment 3C, noting that the unit wasn't listed on the directory board. His response challenged everything I had just experienced. Apartment 3C has been sealed since 1993, he told me. Tenant died, no family claimed the belongings, landlord just sealed it up rather than clean it out. Nobody's been in there for 30 years. I returned to the 3rd floor with the superintendent, who showed me that the door I had entered was indeed sealed with an official notice from the housing authority, dated 1993. The hardware I had noticed as being different was actually a heavy-duty security seal. According to his records, the last tenant had been D. Morrison, an elderly man who had died in the apartment and not been discovered for several weeks. As I reviewed my completed assessment forms, I realized that my home visit had been conducted with the institutional memory of someone who had lived independently in that apartment for decades before his death. The assessment had been accurate. Mr. Morrison had indeed demonstrated capacity for independent living, and conservatorship wasn't necessary. These conclusions remained valid even though the individual I had assessed no longer existed in conventional terms. I filed my report recommending against conservatorship proceedings, though I suspected the referral itself had originated from the same temporal disconnection that had enabled the assessment to occur. Some social work extends beyond the boundaries between life and death, providing services for individuals who continue to require advocacy, even after conventional social services are no longer needed. My caseload continues to include periodic follow-up visits to 1247 Maple Street, Apartment 3C, though I suspect these appointments serve more to maintain my own professional competence than to address any ongoing needs Mr. Morrison might have. Some home visits assess not just current functional capacity, but also the ongoing dignity of individuals who require advocacy that transcends the normal boundaries of life and social service delivery. Social work sometimes requires advocates who can provide services across the boundaries between life and continued need for dignity. Some home visits assess not just current capacity, but ongoing requirements for respect that transcend conventional social service parameters. I arrived at my art therapy studio this morning to find patient X's canvas had been painted overnight, not completed, but fundamentally changed from the abstract landscape we had been working on yesterday into a detailed portrait of someone I had never seen, yet somehow recognized as a patient who had died at Millbrook 40 years before I was born. My name is Dr. Amanda Wilson, and for 20 years I have served as the primary art therapist at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Art therapy utilizes creative expression as a medium for psychological healing, allowing patients to explore and communicate experiences that may be difficult to express through traditional verbal therapy. My studio on the 4th floor provides a safe space where individuals can externalize internal struggles through visual creation. The art therapy studio occupies a large, well-lit room with floor-to-ceiling windows facing north, providing consistent natural light throughout the day. The space is equipped with easels, work tables, storage for various artistic media, and display areas where patients can exhibit their completed works. Over 2 decades, hundreds of patients have created thousands of artistic expressions within these walls, each piece representing a unique journey toward psychological understanding and healing. Art therapy operates on the principle that creative expression can access psychological material that remains hidden from conscious awareness. Through painting, drawing, sculpture, and collage work, patients often discover insights about their conditions, relationships, and recovery goals that wouldn't emerge through traditional talk therapy. My role involves facilitating this creative process while helping patients interpret the symbolic content of their artistic expressions. Patient X first appeared in my studio 3 months ago, referred for art therapy to address treatment-resistant depression with catatonic features. The initial consultation revealed someone with minimal verbal communication, but apparent interest in visual expression. They gravitated immediately toward oil painting, showing unusual familiarity with advanced techniques despite having no documented artistic training or previous experience. During our first session, patient X began working on an abstract landscape using colors and brushstrokes that suggested formal artistic education. Their approach to composition, color mixing, and canvas preparation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of painting fundamentals. When I asked about their artistic background, they simply shrugged and continued working without verbal response. Over subsequent sessions, patient X's artwork evolved in ways that challenged my understanding of therapeutic artistic development. Instead of showing gradual improvement in technical skills, their paintings displayed mastery that seemed to emerge fully formed. More disturbing, the artworks appeared to continue developing between sessions, showing modifications and refinements that occurred when no one was present in the studio. The first clear evidence of impossible artistic development occurred after our 6th session. Patient X had been working on an abstract seascape using blues and grays to express feelings of isolation and depression. I photographed the work in progress as part of my standard documentation process. When we returned the following week, The painting had been transformed into a detailed, realistic portrait of an elderly man in hospital clothing, painted with techniques that exceeded anything patient X had previously demonstrated. I began documenting these overnight transformations with time-lapse photography, setting up cameras to record any changes that occurred in the studio between sessions. The footage revealed patient X's paintings modifying themselves through processes that defied physical laws. Brushstrokes appeared without brushes, colors blended without mixing, and entirely new compositional elements materialized on canvases that had been securely stored in locked cabinets. The transformed artworks consistently depicted people in hospital settings, painted with intimate knowledge of Millbrook's interior spaces and historical details. The portraits showed patients and staff wearing clothing styles from various decades, positioned in rooms that had been renovated or demolished years earlier. Each painting captured specific individuals with photographic accuracy, yet depicted people I had never encountered during my 20 years at the hospital. When I researched the identities of the portrait subjects using archived hospital records, I discovered that patient X's impossible artworks were depicting actual individuals who had been treated at Millbrook during previous decades. The elderly man from the seascape transformation had been a long-term patient who died in 1987. Other portraits showed staff members from the 1960s and 1970s, patients from the early days of psychiatric treatment, and scenes from periods when art therapy wasn't yet available as a treatment modality. I realized that patient X wasn't creating individual artistic expressions, but serving as a conduit through which the accumulated artistic needs of Millbrook's history were being fulfilled. The studio had somehow become a space where artistic expression transcended individual therapeutic goals, providing creative outlets for psychological material that had been seeking expression across decades. The breakthrough came when I discovered that the artistic transformations were occurring on anniversary dates of significant events in the subjects' lives. The elderly man's portrait had appeared on the 30th anniversary of his death. Other artworks manifested on dates corresponding to admissions, treatments, or traumatic incidents experienced by the individuals depicted. Patient X, I understood, wasn't an individual patient requiring art therapy, but rather a therapeutic medium through which the artistic needs of Millbrook's entire history were being addressed. The studio served not only current patients, but also provided creative expression opportunities for individuals who had needed art therapy during periods when such treatment wasn't available. As I prepare for my retirement next month, I realize that my replacement will inherit a studio that operates according to principles more complex than conventional art therapy training addresses. Patient X will continue to serve as a creative conduit, and the studio will remain a space where artistic expression transcends individual therapeutic goals to serve the accumulated psychological needs of everyone who has ever required creative healing at Millbrook. The canvas patient X worked on during yesterday's session now shows a group portrait of art therapy patients from across the decades, all engaged in creative work together, their faces showing the peace that comes from finally having the opportunity to express experiences that had been waiting years or decades for appropriate artistic outlet. The admission form that printed automatically at 3:42 a.m. was for a patient named J. Millbrook, showing an admission date of June 15, 1987. Exactly 37 years ago, yet the insurance authorization was current. The attending physician's signature was from Dr. Morrison, and the emergency contact listed my direct office phone number. My name is Linda Roberts, and for 15 years I have served as the primary unit secretary for the adult psychiatric ward at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. My role involves managing all administrative aspects of patient care, processing admissions and discharges, coordinating insurance authorizations, maintaining medical records, and serving as the communication hub between medical staff, patients, families, and external agencies. The psychiatric unit secretary position requires mastery of complex administrative systems that govern mental health care delivery. Every patient admission generates dozens of forms: insurance verification, treatment authorizations, legal documentation for involuntary holds, medication consent forms, and discharge planning requirements. My computer terminal serves as the nerve center for this administrative ecosystem, tracking patient status, coordinating care team communications, and ensuring regulatory compliance. My workstation occupies the central hub of the psychiatric unit, positioned to provide visual oversight of patient areas while maintaining security protocols for confidential information. Multiple computer monitors display real-time patient census data, staff schedules, medication administration records, and communication systems that connect our unit with other hospital departments and external agencies. The administrative workflow follows predictable patterns throughout each shift. Morning responsibilities include processing overnight admissions, updating census reports, and coordinating with insurance companies for continued stay authorizations. Afternoon tasks involve discharge planning, scheduling appointments, and managing communication between treatment teams and patient families. Evening duties focus on preparing overnight coverage and ensuring all documentation is current for the following day's activities. 6 weeks ago, my computer system began generating forms for patients I had never encountered. These phantom administrative documents appeared during routine system updates, printing automatically without any manual input from staff. The forms followed standard formatting and contained appropriate medical terminology, yet documented patients whose names didn't appear in our official census records. The first phantom form was an admission document for J. Millbrook, dated June 15, 1987, with current insurance authorization numbers and physician signatures from staff I recognized. The emergency contact information listed my direct office phone number, though I had no memory of receiving any calls related to this patient. The admission diagnosis was listed as chronic psychiatric condition requiring indefinite institutional care. Initially, I assumed the phantom forms resulted from computer system errors during software updates or database maintenance. Healthcare information systems occasionally generate duplicate records or retrieve archived data inappropriately. I reported the anomalies to our IT department and continued following standard administrative protocols. However, as weeks passed, the phantom forms increased in frequency and complexity. My system generated discharge summaries for patients who had never been officially admitted, insurance authorization renewals for cases that didn't exist in billing records, and medication administration reports for individuals whose names appeared nowhere in our pharmacy database. The phantom administrative documents followed patterns consistent with historical psychiatric care practices that predated electronic record systems. The forms documented long-term institutional stays, treatment approaches that were no longer used, and insurance arrangements that reflected healthcare policies from previous decades. When I researched the patient names on phantom forms using archived paper records stored in the hospital basement, I discovered that these individuals had actually received treatment at Millbrook during periods when administrative documentation was less comprehensive. J. Millbrook had been a patient in 1987, but his treatment records were incomplete due to a clerical error that resulted in lost paperwork. I realized that my computer system was generating retroactive administrative documentation for patients whose care had been inadequately recorded during earlier periods in the hospital's history. The phantom forms represented the administrative component of treatment that these individuals should have received, but didn't due to clerical limitations or system failures that occurred decades earlier. The most disturbing aspect of the phantom forms was their integration with current administrative systems. Insurance companies accepted the retroactive authorizations, billing departments processed the phantom charges, and regulatory agencies approved the documentation as if these patients were receiving ongoing treatment in the present moment. As I documented the phantom administrative activity, I discovered that my computer records were being synchronized with historical treatment files dating back to the hospital's founding. Patients from previous decades were showing complete administrative documentation for treatment periods that had been inadequately recorded at the time they actually received care. The administrative system, I understood, wasn't just processing current patient records, but was serving as a temporal correction mechanism, ensuring that complete documentation existed for everyone who had ever received treatment at Millbrook, regardless of when they happened to require care or what administrative systems were available during their treatment periods. As I prepare for my retirement next month, I realize that my replacement will inherit an administrative system that operates according to principles more complex than conventional healthcare documentation. The phantom forms will continue to generate, the retroactive administrative work will continue processing, and some secretarial duties will extend across decades to ensure complete records for everyone who has ever needed psychiatric care. My final day includes processing 43 current patient records and 78 phantom administrative documents dating back to 1923, all requiring the same careful attention to detail and regulatory compliance. The computer system maintains perfect records for everyone who has ever received treatment at Millbrook, ensuring that administrative care transcends the chronological limitations of documentation systems and clerical availability. During today's group therapy session, I realized that for 6 months we had been adjusting our seating arrangement to accommodate a seventh member who never spoke, never moved, and whose name none of the other group members could remember, yet whose presence we all acknowledged as essential to our therapeutic work. My name is Dr. James Wright, and for 14 years I have facilitated group therapy sessions at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Group therapy utilizes the power of collective healing, bringing together individuals with similar psychological challenges to share experiences, provide mutual support, and learn recovery strategies through peer interaction. My role involves creating safe therapeutic spaces where vulnerability becomes strength and isolation transforms into connection. The group therapy room occupies a quiet corner of the 3rd floor, furnished with 7 comfortable chairs arranged in a perfect circle to ensure equal participation and visual contact among all members. The room's design eliminates hierarchy. No desk, no elevated seating, no barriers between facilitator and participants. This democratic arrangement reflects the fundamental principle that healing occurs through shared experience rather than expert intervention. Each group therapy session follows a structured format designed to maximize therapeutic benefit while maintaining emotional safety. Sessions begin with a brief check-in, proceed through guided discussion of weekly themes, and conclude with goal setting for individual progress between meetings. My role involves facilitating conversation, ensuring balanced participation, and helping group members process difficult emotions within the supportive container of collective understanding. The current group has been meeting for 8 months, consisting of 6 individuals receiving treatment for various mood disorders. The membership includes 2 patients with treatment-resistant depression, 1 individual managing bipolar disorder, 2 patients with anxiety disorders, and 1 person recovering from substance abuse complicated by underlying psychiatric conditions. Each brings unique perspectives while sharing common experiences of mental health challenges. 6 months ago, I began noticing that our group dynamics had shifted to accommodate what appeared to be a 7th participant. The other group members would automatically adjust their seating to leave 1 chair available, would pause during conversations as if listening to unheard contributions, and would reference insights or observations that no one in the visible group had actually expressed. Initially, I assumed this phantom presence represented the group's collective unconscious, a psychological phenomenon where shared therapeutic work creates symbolic representations of healing processes. Group therapy often generates imaginary figures that embody recovery goals or represent therapeutic insights that the group is developing together. However, as weeks passed, the phantom group member became increasingly integrated into our therapeutic work. Other participants would respond to unheard comments, would build upon invisible contributions to discussions, and would express gratitude for support. They were apparently receiving from someone who wasn't visibly present in the room. The most striking aspect of the phantom group member was that everyone acknowledged their presence without being able to describe them specifically. When I asked group members to discuss their experience of this 7th participant, they would speak about feeling supported and understood by someone whose insights were particularly helpful. Yet none could recall specific statements or describe any identifying characteristics. I began documenting these references to the phantom group member, recording sessions to analyze patterns in how the group integrated their invisible participant. The audio recordings revealed something disturbing. Gaps in conversation where someone was clearly speaking, but no audible voice could be detected. The other group members were responding to verbal contributions that weren't being captured by recording equipment. When I enhanced the audio recordings using specialized software, the phantom contributions became audible, revealing therapeutic insights that demonstrated remarkable understanding of each group member's psychological needs. The invisible participant was providing support and guidance that exceeded anything I could offer as a professional facilitator. Speaking with knowledge of each individual's history and therapeutic requirements that suggested intimate familiarity with their treatment. Researched the history of group therapy at Millbrook and discovered that the phantom participant had been acknowledged by previous therapy groups dating back over 20 years. Different facilitators had documented the same phenomenon. Group members adjusting to accommodate an invisible seventh participant who provided therapeutic insights and emotional support that enhanced the healing process for everyone involved. The pattern revealed that the phantom group member represented the accumulated wisdom of every group therapy session that had ever been conducted in this room. Decades of shared healing experiences had created a therapeutic presence that continued to participate in ongoing group work, providing insights and support that drew from the collective recovery experiences of hundreds of previous participants. I realized that some group therapy transcends individual sessions, creating therapeutic relationships that persist across decades and connect current participants with the healing wisdom of everyone who had ever engaged in group work at Millbrook. The phantom group member served as a bridge between current therapeutic needs and the accumulated recovery experience of the institution's history. As I prepare for my transfer to private practice next month, I understand that my replacement will inherit a group that includes 7 members, though only 6 will be visibly present. The phantom participant will continue to provide therapeutic insights and emotional support, ensuring that the group benefits from decades of accumulated healing wisdom that transcends individual facilitator capabilities. My final group session included 6 visible participants and 1 invisible member who provided closing observations about the group's progress and offered encouragement for continued recovery work. The therapeutic circle will remain complete, with 7 chairs occupied by individuals committed to healing, regardless of which realm they happen to inhabit during their participation in the ongoing work of collective recovery. I found myself standing in room 237 at 3:47 a.m., staring at an indentation in the mattress that was still warm to the touch, knowing with absolute certainty that this room had been empty for 6 months. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've been the night shift supervisor at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 8 years. In that time, I've walked approximately 11,680 miles through these corridors, my master keys jingling against my hip in a rhythm that's become as familiar as my own heartbeat. The night shift at a psychiatric facility operates on precision, not the frantic urgency of an emergency room, but the methodical cadence of institutional care that continues even while the world sleeps. My rounds begin at 10 p.m. sharp. First, the medication verification with Thomas in the pharmacy wing, then the security walkthrough with building services. By 10:45, I'm moving through the patient floors, clipboard in hand, checking that doors are properly secured, observation windows clear, and night staff positioned according to protocol. Room 237 sits at the end of the east corridor on the 2nd floor, part of the extended stay wing that houses our most challenging cases. The room had been empty since March, when Mrs. Holloway was transferred to long-term care after her family could no longer afford private treatment. I remember the day clearly because she'd left behind a small ceramic bird on the windowsill, which I'd personally packed with her belongings. The room was cleaned, disinfected, and officially marked vacant in our census system. Yet tonight, my tablet showed it as occupied. Initially, I assumed it was a clerical error. Our electronic system occasionally glitched, especially during census updates. I made a mental note to inform IT in the morning and continued my rounds. But as I passed room 237, I noticed the observation light was on, the small red indicator that signals a patient requiring enhanced monitoring. Standard protocol demanded investigation. I knocked gently, as we're trained to do even with supposedly empty rooms. "Security check," I announced, sliding my master key into the lock. The door opened to reveal a room that should have been vacant, yet felt distinctly occupied. The bed appeared rumpled, as if someone had been lying there moments before. The ceramic bird sat on the windowsill, the same one I'd personally packed 6 months earlier. I checked my tablet again. Patient status, occupied. Assigned physician, Dr. Morrison. Admission date, March 15th. But Mrs. Holloway had been discharged on March 15th, not admitted. I pulled up the detailed record. The patient name read H. Millbrook, a name I'd never encountered in our system, yet somehow familiar. Over the following nights, room 237 became my primary concern. The tablet consistently showed it as occupied, yet visual inspection revealed an empty room with increasingly personal touches that shouldn't exist. A water glass half filled on the nightstand, A book splayed open to page 147. Slippers positioned beside the bed as if recently removed. I began documenting everything with photographs on my personal phone. The images showed an empty room, yet my eyes saw clear evidence of habitation. The disparity between digital record and physical observation created a cognitive dissonance that left me questioning my own perceptions. On the seventh night, I encountered Dr. Morrison in the corridor outside room 237. I'd worked with him for 3 years, a competent psychiatrist with a particular gift for treating elderly patients with dementia-related behavioral issues. "How's Mrs. Millbrook tonight?" he asked, checking his own tablet. "I'm sorry, doctor, but that room is empty. Has been since March." He frowned, consulting his device. "Sarah, I just finished my evening consultation with her. She's responding well to the new medication regimen, sleeping more peacefully." I showed him my tablet, pointing to the vacant room status. His screen showed detailed treatment notes, medication schedules, and progress reports for a patient who, according to my system, didn't exist. We stood in the hallway, 2 medical professionals looking at identical devices displaying completely different realities. That's when I began to understand that Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital might operate according to rules more complex than our training manual suggested. I started researching the hospital's history, diving into archived records that hadn't been digitized. What I found in the basement file storage changed everything. Helena Millbrook had been the hospital's first patient when it opened in 1923. She'd lived here for 67 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in room 237 in 1990. But according to the records, she'd never been officially discharged. Her file remained perpetually active, her treatment continuing in some administrative limbo that existed between official documentation and institutional memory. The final piece fell into place when I discovered that room 237's occupancy status updated itself automatically every night at exactly 3:47 a.m., the documented time of Helena Millbrook's death. Our electronic system, in its attempt to maintain perfect records, had somehow incorporated her eternal residency into its operational parameters. Tonight marks my final night shift at Millbrook. I've accepted a position at a newer facility across town, one with modern systems and no century-old patient files. But as I prepare to turn in my keys, I realize that some responsibilities transcend employment contracts. Room 237 will need a supervisor who understands that patient care sometimes extends beyond the conventional boundaries of life and discharge. I've left detailed instructions for my replacement, though I doubt they'll believe them initially. They'll discover, as I did, that certain rounds never truly end, and some patients require a level of care that exists in the spaces between documented medicine and the eternal needs of the human soul. The tablet shows room 237 as occupied tonight, and I suspect it always will. Some supervisors finish their shifts and go home. Others become permanent residents of the institutions they've served, their vigilance extending far beyond the normal parameters of professional duty. The master keys to any institution carry more weight than their physical mass might suggest. Some doors, once opened, lead to responsibilities that extend far beyond a single shift, and some rounds continue long after the supervisor has clocked out for the final time. The intake form sitting on my desk was completed in my handwriting, signed with my credentials. Documenting a patient interview I had absolutely no memory of conducting, yet every detail felt intimately familiar, as if I'd written it in a dream I couldn't quite remember. I am Marcus Johnson, licensed clinical social worker, and for the past 7 years I have served as Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital's primary intake specialist. My office, tucked into the east wing between the main lobby and the patient floors, processes the initial contact between crisis and care. Every person who enters this facility for psychiatric treatment passes through my assessment process first. The work requires a particular temperament, equal parts empathy and clinical detachment. I interview individuals in their most vulnerable moments, translating raw human suffering into the standardized language of mental health diagnosis. My office walls are lined with filing cabinets containing over 3,000 intake assessments, each representing someone's darkest hour transformed into actionable treatment data. My intake protocol never varies. First, the preliminary paperwork, insurance verification, emergency contacts, basic demographic information. Then the clinical interview itself, conducted using the structured clinical interview for DSM-5 disorders. I take detailed notes by hand, a practice that predates electronic records and one I've never abandoned. The handwritten assessment creates a more personal connection with the patient's narrative than typing into a computer screen. Each completed intake file follows the same organizational structure. Demographics on top, insurance forms in the middle, my handwritten clinical notes at the bottom, all secured with a standard paperclip in the upper left corner. After completion, files are immediately entered into our electronic system and physically stored in designated filing cabinets organized by admission date. On Tuesday morning, October 15th, I arrived to find a completed intake file on my desk. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes I work late and leave files for electronic entry the following morning. But as I reviewed the paperwork, I realized I had no memory of conducting this particular assessment. The patient name was listed as M. Henderson, admitted for evaluation of severe depression with psychotic features. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. I recognized my characteristic method of forming certain letters, the way I abbreviated common clinical terms, even my tendency to press harder with the pen when writing particularly significant observations. Yet I had no recollection of meeting Mr. Henderson. The clinical notes described a patient who'd been found wandering downtown in a dissociative state, brought in by police after concerned citizens reported someone talking to invisible companions. The individual had been lucid during intake, providing coherent responses to my standard questions while maintaining that the other people were still present in the room with us. What disturbed me most wasn't the content of the notes, but their intimate detail. I'd documented specific physical mannerisms, quoted exact phrases from our conversation, noted subtle behavioral observations that could only come from direct personal interaction. The assessment read like the work of someone who'd spent considerable time with this patient, developing the kind of clinical rapport that requires careful cultivation. I checked our electronic admission system. No record of M. Henderson appeared in any database. I contacted the night security staff who would have processed any police-initiated admissions. They had no record of anyone being brought in by law enforcement in the past week. Yet the intake form contained a police report number that, when I called to verify, didn't exist in their system either. Over the following days, I began finding additional files I couldn't remember creating. Each followed my exact documentation style, contained my authentic handwriting, and described patients with conditions that fell well within my area of expertise. Yet these individuals seemed to exist only within my filing system, documented nowhere else in the hospital's comprehensive records. The cases themselves were fascinating from a clinical perspective. M. Henderson's assessment described auditory and visual hallucinations that followed recognizable patterns of psychotic disorders, but with unusual consistency and detail that suggested something beyond typical psychiatric presentation. Another file, for K. Williams, documented a patient who claimed to be receiving treatment at Millbrook in 1987, despite appearing to be no older than 35. I started staying late to review these mysterious files more carefully. The clinical notes revealed a disturbing pattern. Each patient had been admitted with complaints directly related to the hospital itself. They reported seeing staff members who died years earlier, receiving treatment in rooms that had been demolished during renovations, participating in therapy programs that had been discontinued decades ago. As I delved deeper into these impossible cases, I realized that my handwriting in these files was evolving. The earlier mysterious assessments matched my current documentation style perfectly, but the more recent ones showed subtle changes, slightly different letter formations, varying pen pressure, small stylistic variations that suggested someone else was learning to replicate my writing. The breakthrough came when I discovered that the mysterious intake files were appearing in chronological order, corresponding to significant dates in the hospital's
history. M. Henderson's admission date matched the
anniversary of Millbrook's first psychiatric fatality in 1924. K. Williams' file appeared on the date of the hospital's major fire in 1987. Each impossible patient seemed connected to some traumatic event in the institution's past. I began researching the hospital's archives, looking for any connection between these mysterious patients and actual historical events. What I found challenged everything I understood about the nature of psychiatric assessment and the boundaries between clinical documentation and institutional memory. The names on my impossible intake files weren't random. They were variations of real patients who'd been treated at Millbrook during particularly tragic periods in the hospital's history. M. Henderson had been Mary Henderson, who died during experimental treatment in 1924. K. Williams was Karen Williams, who perished in the 1987 fire while waiting for discharge. But the most disturbing discovery was that my handwriting samples from these mysterious files, when compared with archived intake assessments from previous decades, showed remarkable similarity to documentation styles used by my predecessors. It was as if the role of intake specialist carried with it some kind of inherited responsibility to continue documenting cases that transcended the normal boundaries of admission and discharge. Realized that some patients never truly complete the intake process. Their initial assessments remain perpetually active, requiring ongoing documentation by whoever occupies the intake specialist position. The files I couldn't remember creating were part of a continuous assessment process that extended across decades, maintained by each successive intake specialist who'd inherited this office and its responsibilities. My final day in this position is tomorrow. I've accepted a transfer to outpatient services, hoping that a change of environment might break whatever connection has developed between my professional identity and these impossible cases. But as I prepare to hand over my files to my replacement, I wonder if the mysterious assessments will continue appearing on the intake specialist's desk, requiring documentation in handwriting that becomes more familiar with each impossible patient evaluated. Some intake assessments are never truly completed, and some specialists never finish their documentation responsibilities, even after they've moved on to other positions. The files suggest that patient evaluation at Millbrook operates according to principles that extend far beyond conventional clinical practice. Documentation creates its own reality, and sometimes the most important assessments are the ones we have no memory of conducting. The intake process, it seems, continues long after both patient and specialist have moved on to their next assignments. The prayer request I found in the chapel donation box this morning was written in a language that resembled ancient Aramaic. Yet when I read it aloud, I understood perfectly that someone was asking God to help them remember how to die properly. I am Father Michael Thompson, and for 23 years I have served as chaplain at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. My ministry here differs significantly from traditional parish work. Instead of scheduled services and predictable liturgical cycles, I provide spiritual care in moments of acute psychological crisis, offering comfort to patients and families navigating the complex intersection of mental illness and faith. My chapel occupies the northeast corner of the third floor, a simple space with 12 pews, a modest altar, and stained glass windows that cast colored patterns across the room throughout the day. The space remains open 24 hours, serving as a sanctuary for anyone seeking quiet reflection or spiritual solace. I maintain regular office hours, but much of my work involves responding to immediate pastoral needs whenever they arise. The chapel includes a traditional donation box near the entrance, primarily used for monetary contributions to support our ministry programs. However, patients and visitors frequently leave prayer requests in written form, asking for intercession on behalf of their loved ones or themselves. Over the years, I have received thousands of these written prayers, each representing someone's deepest hopes and fears expressed in their most vulnerable moments. Most prayer requests follow predictable patterns: pleas for healing, requests for strength during difficult treatments, expressions of gratitude for medical staff, or simple acknowledgments of suffering that seek divine comfort. I read each request carefully, incorporating them into my personal prayer practice and following up with pastoral visits when appropriate. These written prayers provide insight into the spiritual dimensions of mental health treatment that formal medical records cannot capture. 3 months ago, I began finding prayer requests written in languages I couldn't immediately identify. The first appeared to be written in Latin, though using grammatical structures I didn't recognize from my seminary training. When I attempted to translate it using reference materials in my office, I discovered that while individual words were familiar, the overall syntax suggested a variant of Latin that didn't correspond to any historical period I could identify. As weeks passed, the mysterious prayer requests became more frequent and linguistically diverse. I found prayers written in what appeared to be ancient Greek, medieval Hebrew, and scripts that resembled Sanskrit or Coptic, yet none matched exactly with reference materials available in theological libraries. Each request seemed to follow traditional prayer formats, but asking for interventions that extended beyond conventional spiritual needs. The breakthrough came when I realized that despite not being able to translate these prayers using standard linguistic resources, I somehow understood their meaning when I read them aloud. The prayer in apparent Latin was requesting divine assistance for someone who couldn't remember their original name. The Greek-style text asked for help in finding the correct time period to which they belonged. The Hebrew-like script requested guidance in completing a confession that had been interrupted by death. These impossible prayer requests described spiritual needs that transcended normal human experience. They came from individuals who seemed to exist in some liminal space between life and death, seeking divine intervention for conditions that extended beyond conventional theological understanding. Each prayer suggested someone who was spiritually lost in ways that exceeded the typical existential crises I encountered in psychiatric ministry. I began documenting these unusual prayer requests with the same care I applied to other aspects of my pastoral work. The linguistic analysis revealed that while the writing systems appeared to derive from historical languages, they represented evolutionary developments that shouldn't exist, as if these languages had continued developing long after they were no longer spoken by living communities. The most disturbing realization was that the prayer requests were accumulating in chronological order, corresponding to significant dates in the hospital's history. The first mysterious prayer appeared on the anniversary of Millbrook's founding in 1923. Others corresponded to dates of major incidents: the fire of 1987, the renovation of 1995, the closure of the children's ward in 2003. Each impossible prayer seemed connected to some traumatic event in the institution's past. As I researched the hospital's history more thoroughly, I discovered that each date associated with mysterious prayer requests corresponded to the death of a patient or staff member under circumstances that left spiritual questions unresolved. People who had died suddenly, without opportunity for final confession or spiritual preparation. Individuals whose deaths had occurred during periods when no chaplain was available to provide last rites. I realized that the mysterious prayer requests represented ongoing spiritual needs that transcended physical death. These were prayers from souls who remained connected to Millbrook because their spiritual requirements had been left unfulfilled at the time of their passing. The impossible languages were evolved forms of the languages they had spoken in life, developed through decades or centuries of continued spiritual existence. The chapel, it seemed, served not only living patients and families, but also provided ongoing spiritual care for those who had died at Millbrook with unfinished spiritual business. The donation box functioned as a communication method between the realm of the living and souls who still required pastoral attention. As I prepare for my retirement next month, I understand that my replacement will inherit responsibilities that extend beyond conventional hospital chaplaincy. The ministry at Millbrook includes providing spiritual care for individuals whose needs transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. Some prayers require answers that can only be provided by chaplains who understand that pastoral care sometimes extends across centuries. I have prepared detailed notes for my successor, though I suspect the mysterious prayer requests will provide more thorough training than my documentation ever could. The chapel will continue to serve as a sanctuary for both the living and the dead, and some prayers will continue to be answered long after the original petitioner has moved beyond conventional understanding of spiritual need. The donation box contains 17 new prayer requests this morning, written in languages that haven't been spoken for decades, asking for spiritual interventions that require a chaplain who understands that ministry sometimes extends far beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. Spiritual care sometimes requires ministers who can provide comfort across the boundaries between life and death. Some prayers are answered not in this world, but in the spaces between worlds where souls continue to seek divine intervention. The crisis hotline caller at 3:17 a.m. was describing their suicidal ideation with the same phrases, in the same order, using the same pauses for emphasis, as they had for the past 47 consecutive nights. Yet when I checked our call logs, no record of previous conversations existed. My name is Rebecca Adams, and for 4 years I have staffed the Crisis Intervention Hotline at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. The crisis line operates 24 hours a day, providing immediate telephone support for individuals experiencing acute psychiatric emergencies. My shift runs from midnight to 8 a.m., during the hours when isolation and despair often reach their peak intensity. The crisis hotline occupies a small office on the second floor, equipped with multiple phone lines, a computer terminal for accessing emergency resources, and direct connections to mobile crisis teams and emergency services. The room's single window overlooks the hospital parking lot, where I can observe the constant flow of ambulances and emergency vehicles that represent the physical manifestation of the psychological crises I handle by telephone. Crisis intervention requires specific communication skills, active listening, empathetic response, risk assessment, and safety planning. Each call follows a general protocol, but must be individualized based on the caller's specific circumstances and level of distress. My role is to provide immediate emotional support while connecting callers with appropriate long-term resources and ensuring their immediate safety. The call log system automatically records basic information about each interaction, time of call, duration, general nature of crisis, disposition, and follow-up requirements. This documentation serves both clinical and administrative purposes, helping identify patterns in crisis calls and ensuring appropriate continuity of care for frequent callers. The 3:17 a.m. call first appeared on my log 8 weeks ago. The caller identified themselves only as Jay and described experiencing suicidal ideation with a specific plan and means. Their presentation was articulate and organized. They spoke about their despair with clinical precision, describing symptoms that suggested severe depression with psychotic features. The conversation lasted exactly 43 minutes and ended when they agreed to safety planning and promised to call back if their suicidal thoughts intensified. The following night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., Jay called again. The conversation began with identical phrasing. "I need to talk to someone about some thoughts I've been having." The description of their suicidal ideation followed the same sequence, using the same terminology, with identical pauses and emphasis patterns. It was as if they were reading from a script they had memorized perfectly. Initially, I assumed this similarity reflected the repetitive nature of crisis calls from individuals with chronic suicidal ideation. Many frequent callers develop standardized ways of describing their distress, using familiar phrases that help them communicate complex emotional states. However, as the nightly calls continued, I realized the conversations weren't just similar, they were identical. By the second week, I began taking more detailed notes during Jay's calls, documenting specific phrases, the order of topics discussed, and the exact timing of conversational transitions. The pattern was unmistakable. Each night's call followed the previous night's conversation with perfect precision, as if the same 43-minute interaction was being repeated exactly. What made this repetition particularly disturbing was that Jay seemed unaware of the previous calls. Each conversation began as if it were our first contact, with Jay explaining their situation as new information. When I referenced previous calls or attempted to build on safety plans we had developed, Jay responded with confusion, as if these interactions had never occurred. I checked the electronic call log system to review documentation of Jay's previous calls. Despite my clear memory of 47 consecutive nightly conversations, the system showed only sporadic entries: a call on the initial date, another entry 3 weeks later, and scattered records that bore no relationship to the consistent pattern I was experiencing. The discrepancy between my experience and the official records created a cognitive dissonance that began affecting my performance on other crisis calls. I started questioning my memory, wondering if the repetitive nature of crisis work was causing me to conflate different conversations or fabricate continuity that didn't exist. Yet each night at 3:17 a.m., Jay's call came through with predictable consistency. I began recording the calls on my personal device, hoping to document the repetitive pattern and resolve the discrepancy between my experience and the official logs. The recordings revealed something more disturbing than simple repetition. While I could hear my own voice clearly, Jay's responses were barely audible, as if they were speaking from a great distance or through some kind of interference. When I enhanced the audio recordings using computer software, Jay's voice became clearer, but the content was more unsettling than I had realized during the live conversations. Between the familiar phrases about suicidal ideation, Jay was describing circumstances that couldn't be real. Receiving treatment at Millbrook in 1987, talking to counselors who had died decades ago, planning suicide using methods that hadn't been available for years. I realized that Jay wasn't calling from the present moment, but from some temporal space that overlapped with but didn't coincide with my current reality. The crisis call was occurring simultaneously across multiple time periods, with Jay reaching out from a moment of acute distress that had become temporally fixed, requiring ongoing intervention from whatever crisis counselor happened to be available at 3:17 a.m. As I prepare for my final week in this position before transitioning to day shift work, I understand that my replacement will inherit Jay's nightly calls. The crisis intervention will continue. The same 43-minute conversation will unfold at exactly 3:17 a.m., and some counselor will provide support for a moment of despair that transcends the normal boundaries of time and resolved crisis. The crisis hotline serves not only individuals experiencing immediate psychological emergencies, but also provides ongoing support for moments of acute distress that have become permanently suspended in time, requiring intervention from counselors who understand that some crises never fully resolve, only become temporarily stabilized until the next night's call. Crisis intervention sometimes extends beyond individual emergencies to include ongoing support for moments of despair that have become temporally fixed. Some crises require counselors who can provide comfort across the boundaries between past emergencies and present availability. When I finished my medication round at 11:15 p.m. and returned my cart to the pharmacy, I discovered that I had dispensed 47 doses of medications to patients whose names weren't on my roster, using pills that weren't in my cart when I began my rounds at 9 p.m. My name is Thomas Miller, and for 6 years I have worked the evening shift as a psychiatric nurse at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. My primary responsibility involves administering nighttime medications to patients on the adult inpatient unit, a process that requires absolute precision, careful documentation, and thorough knowledge of psychiatric pharmaceuticals and their interactions. The evening medication round begins at exactly 9 p.m. with preparation at the secured pharmacy station. I review the medication administration record for each patient, verify dosages against physician orders, and organize individual doses in the locked medication cart that accompanies me throughout the building. The process is systematic and standardized, designed to eliminate errors and ensure patient safety. Each patient receives medications appropriate to their specific psychiatric conditions: antipsychotics for patients with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, antidepressants for mood disorders, anxiolytics for anxiety conditions, and mood stabilizers for various diagnostic categories. The combinations are carefully calibrated by psychiatrists and monitored for both therapeutic effectiveness and potential adverse reactions. My medication cart contains 43 separate locked compartments, each corresponding to a specific patient room and containing that individual's prescribed evening medications. The cart itself tracks my movements through radio frequency identification, automatically logging when I access each compartment and documenting the time and location of every medication administration. The evening medication round follows an invariable route through the hospital. Start with room 201, proceed sequentially through each occupied room, conclude with room 247, return to the pharmacy station by 11:15 p.m. The process typically takes 2 hours and 15 minutes, allowing sufficient time for patient interaction, medication education, and documentation of any concerns or adverse reactions. 6 weeks ago, I began noticing discrepancies between my pre-round preparation and post-round documentation. The medication cart would return to the pharmacy with empty compartments that corresponded to patient rooms I couldn't remember visiting. When I reviewed my documentation, I found detailed notes about medication administration to individuals whose names didn't appear on my official patient roster. Initially, I assumed these discrepancies resulted from clerical errors in the roster system or confusion about patient transfers and discharges that occurred during shift changes. Psychiatric units experience frequent census changes, and medication administration records sometimes lag behind actual patient movements. I reported the discrepancies to the charge nurse and continued following my standard protocol. However, as weeks passed, the pattern became more pronounced and disturbing. My medication cart consistently returned with evidence of having dispensed medications to patients who didn't officially exist in our system. The RFID tracking system showed me accessing patient rooms that weren't listed as occupied, spending appropriate amounts of time for medication administration and patient interaction, yet I had no memory of these encounters. The phantom medication administrations followed the same pattern as my regular rounds: systematic progression through rooms, appropriate time spent with each patient, detailed documentation of medication effects and patient responses. The notes I apparently wrote during these impossible encounters demonstrated the same clinical attention and therapeutic communication I provided to officially recognized patients. When I began staying, after my shift to review these mysterious documentation entries, I discovered that the phantom patients were receiving medications for psychiatric conditions that weren't currently treated at Millbrook. The prescriptions included medications that had been discontinued years ago, dosages that exceeded current safety guidelines, and pharmaceutical combinations that were no longer considered therapeutically appropriate. The breakthrough came when I realized that the phantom medication administrations were occurring in rooms that corresponded to historical room numbers from previous decades, when the hospital had different patient capacity and room numbering systems. My evening rounds were somehow extending beyond current patients to include individuals who had required medication during earlier periods in the hospital's history. I researched archived nursing records and discovered that the phantom patients matched names of individuals who had been treated at Millbrook during the 1980s and 1990s, before modern psychiatric medications were available. These patients had received the medications I was apparently dispensing: older antipsychotics, discontinued mood stabilizers, and pharmaceutical approaches that had been superseded by newer, safer alternatives. The most disturbing realization was that my phantom medication rounds were providing current pharmaceutical care to patients who had been treated during periods when effective psychiatric medications weren't available. The evening medication round had somehow become a method of delivering retroactive treatment to individuals who had suffered from mental illness during eras when therapeutic options were limited. As I prepare for my transition to day shift nursing, I understand that my replacement will inherit the extended medication round that serves both current patients and individuals who required psychiatric medications during previous decades. The evening rounds will continue to provide pharmaceutical care that transcends the normal boundaries between current treatment protocols and historical therapeutic needs. The medication cart will continue to dispense pills to patients who exist in the institutional memory of Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, ensuring that effective psychiatric medications reach individuals who needed them during periods when such treatments weren't available. Some nursing care extends beyond current patient census to include ongoing therapeutic needs that transcend the normal boundaries of pharmaceutical intervention. My final evening medication round included 47 current patients and 33 historical patients, all receiving appropriate psychiatric medications for their specific conditions, regardless of which decade they happened to require treatment. The pharmacy cart returned empty, having dispensed hope in pharmaceutical form to everyone who needed it, across all the years that Millbrook has served individuals struggling with mental illness. The prescription I received this morning was written for Memorazine 50 mg twice daily, a medication that doesn't exist in any pharmaceutical database. Yet when I opened our controlled substance cabinet, I found a full bottle of pills with that exact name and dosage, manufactured by a company that ceased operations in 1987. My name is Rachel Davis, and for 8 years I have served as the chief psychiatric pharmacist at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. My role involves managing all psychotropic medications for the facility, ensuring proper dosaging, monitoring drug interactions, and collaborating with psychiatrists to optimize pharmaceutical treatment plans for our patients. The pharmacy serves as the chemical heart of psychiatric care, where recovery is measured in precise milligram increments. The psychiatric pharmacy operates under strict regulatory protocols due to the controlled nature of many psychotropic medications. Every prescription must be verified against patient records, checked for appropriate dosaging and potential interactions, and documented according to federal guidelines. My computerized pharmacy system tracks every pill dispensed, maintains detailed logs of controlled substances, and provides real-time monitoring of medication adherence for each patient. Psychotropic medications require specialized knowledge that extends beyond general pharmaceutical training. Antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, anxiolytics, and antidepressants each present unique challenges in terms of dosing, side effect management, and interaction potential. My role involves serving as a clinical consultant to physicians, helping optimize medication regimens for maximum therapeutic benefit with minimal adverse effects. The impossible prescription first appeared 6 weeks ago, submitted through our standard electronic prescribing system by Dr. Morrison, a psychiatrist I had worked with for 5 years. The medication ordered was Memorazine 50 mg BID for a patient listed as H. Williams. Neither the medication name nor the patient appeared in any of my reference databases, yet the prescription seemed professionally appropriate and followed standard formatting protocols. Initially, I assumed Memorazine was a new medication that hadn't been updated in our formulary system. New psychotropic drugs are regularly introduced, and sometimes there are delays in database updates. I plan to contact Dr. Morrison for clarification and research the medication through pharmaceutical industry resources. However, when I opened our controlled substance cabinet to verify available inventory, I found a sealed bottle of Memorazine 50 mg tablets, manufactured by Neurological Therapeutics, Inc., with an expiration date of December 1989. The bottle contained exactly 60 tablets, precisely the amount required to fill a 30-day prescription for twice daily dosing. The medication bottle appeared authentic, with appropriate labeling, lot numbers, and safety seals that matched standard pharmaceutical packaging from the 1980s. However, Neurological Therapeutics, Inc. had ceased operations in 1987, and no record of Memorazine appeared in any historical pharmaceutical database I could access. Over the following weeks, similar impossible prescriptions began appearing with increasing frequency. Dr. Morrison, Dr. Harrison, and other physicians whose signatures I recognized were ordering medications that didn't exist for patients whose names didn't appear in our census system. Yet each time I checked our inventory, the required medications were available in exactly the quantities needed to fill the prescriptions. The impossible medications followed patterns consistent with psychiatric pharmaceutical development that might have occurred if certain research directions had been pursued. Memorazine appeared to be an advanced antipsychotic with fewer side effects than currently available medications. Other impossible drugs seemed to represent idealized versions of mood stabilizers, antidepressants, and anxiolytics that addressed current limitations in psychiatric pharmacology. When I researched the patient names associated with these impossible prescriptions, I discovered they corresponded to individuals who had been treated at Millbrook during periods when effective psychiatric medications weren't available. H. Williams had been a patient during the 1940s, when psychiatric treatment consisted primarily of institutional care with limited pharmaceutical interventions. I realized that the impossible prescriptions represented retroactive pharmaceutical care, providing advanced psychiatric medications to patients who had suffered from mental illness during eras when effective treatments didn't exist. The pharmacy had somehow become a temporal distribution center, dispensing medications across decades to individuals who needed them during historically inadequate treatment periods. The most disturbing aspect of filling these impossible prescriptions was that they consistently resulted in positive therapeutic outcomes. Patients receiving Memorazine showed remarkable improvement in psychotic symptoms. Other impossible medications produced therapeutic effects that exceeded anything achievable with currently available pharmaceuticals. As I documented these impossible prescriptions and their therapeutic outcomes, I discovered that my pharmacy records were being integrated into historical treatment files dating back to the hospital's founding. Patients from the 1940s through 1980s were showing medication administration records for advanced psychiatric drugs that hadn't been invented during their treatment periods. The pharmacy, I understood, wasn't just dispensing current medications to present patients, but was serving as a temporal correction mechanism, ensuring that effective psychiatric pharmaceuticals reached individuals who needed them regardless of when they happened to require treatment. Some pharmaceutical care transcends the chronological limitations of drug development and regulatory approval. As I prepare for my transfer to a research position at a pharmaceutical company, I realize that my replacement will inherit a pharmacy that operates according to principles more complex than conventional pharmaceutical practice. The impossible prescriptions will continue to arrive. The non-existent medications will remain available in precisely the required quantities, and some pharmaceutical care will continue to extend across decades to ensure that effective treatment reaches everyone who needs it. My final inventory includes 47 impossible medications that provide therapeutic benefits, exceeding anything available through conventional pharmaceutical development. The controlled substance cabinet contains pills that won't be invented for decades, ensuring that future patients will receive pharmaceutical care that transcends the current limitations of psychiatric treatment. I realized we had been responding to the same psychiatric emergency call for 6 hours when I checked my radio log and discovered that every status update I had transmitted was time-stamped at exactly 14:37. Despite my watch showing it was now past 8 p.m., my name is Sergeant Maria Jackson, and for 12 years I have led the Psychiatric Emergency Response Team for Metro Police Department's Crisis Intervention Unit. Our team specializes in responding to calls involving individuals experiencing acute mental health crises, providing de-escalation services and coordinating with mental health professionals to ensure appropriate care rather than punitive measures. The Psychiatric Emergency Response Team consists of 4 officers trained in crisis intervention techniques, mental health first aid, and coordinated response protocols with local psychiatric facilities. Our unit responds to approximately 1,200 calls annually, ranging from suicide attempts and psychotic episodes to welfare checks and involuntary commitment proceedings that require law enforcement assistance. Each psychiatric emergency call follows established protocols designed to prioritize safety while maximizing therapeutic outcomes. Initial response involves scene assessment, threat evaluation, and establishing communication with the individual in crisis. Our approach emphasizes de-escalation over force, understanding over judgment, and connection with appropriate mental health resources rather than criminal processing. The radio system that coordinates our emergency responses operates on encrypted digital channels with automatic logging of all communications. Every call receives a unique incident number, time-stamped documentation, and real-time tracking of unit locations and status updates. This system ensures accountability, enables coordinated multi-unit responses, and provides data for performance evaluation and training purposes. The call that changed everything came through dispatch at 14:37 on October 15th. Unit 47, respond to Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, 1500 Oak Street Psychiatric Emergency, patient threatening self-harm, staff requesting immediate assistance. The call seemed routine. Hospital security occasionally needed support with agitated patients who posed safety risks to themselves or staff. Our response followed standard protocol. I confirmed the call with dispatch, coordinated with my team members, and activated emergency response procedures for psychiatric crisis intervention at a medical facility. The drive to Millbrook typically takes 12 minutes from our precinct, allowing time to review patient information and coordinate with hospital security regarding access and safety procedures. However, as we drove toward Millbrook, I began noticing that our travel time was extending far beyond normal parameters. Despite maintaining appropriate emergency response speed and following the most direct route, we seemed to be making no progress toward our destination. The radio continued providing updates about the ongoing emergency, but we remained perpetually en route. Without ever arriving at the hospital, I requested status updates from dispatch and discovered that other emergency units had been directed to cover our normal patrol area. Because Unit 47 was committed to ongoing psychiatric emergency response at Millbrook Hospital, according to dispatch records, we had been actively responding to this single call for over 4 hours, though my own chronometer showed only 30 minutes since initial call receipt. When I attempted to communicate our actual location and request guidance about the extended response time, my radio transmissions were being logged as status updates from Millbrook Hospital itself. According to dispatch records, I was providing regular situation reports from the hospital location, describing ongoing crisis intervention work with a psychiatric patient, despite the fact that we had never actually arrived at the hospital. The breakthrough came when I realized that the emergency call was occurring simultaneously across multiple time periods, with our unit responding to a psychiatric crisis that had become temporally extended. The patient requiring intervention existed in a state of perpetual emergency that demanded ongoing crisis response from whatever psychiatric emergency Team happened to be available. I researched historical records of psychiatric emergency calls to Millbrook Hospital and discovered that this same incident had been logged repeatedly over the past 15 years, with different response teams providing identical status updates at exactly 14:37. Each team had experienced the same extended response time, the same inability to physically arrive at the hospital, and the same documentation showing successful crisis intervention despite never reaching the scene. The patient requiring emergency intervention, I realized, wasn't an individual in acute crisis, but rather a persistent emergency condition that required ongoing crisis response capabilities. Some psychiatric emergencies transcend individual incidents, creating temporal crisis states that demand perpetual intervention from trained emergency response teams. As my shift officially ends and I prepare to hand over command to the night response team, I understand that my replacement will inherit this ongoing psychiatric emergency call. Unit 47 will remain perpetually en route to Millbrook Hospital, providing crisis intervention services for an emergency that exists in the spaces between dispatch and arrival, between crisis and resolution. The radio continues to crackle with updates from the ongoing emergency, my voice providing status reports from a location I have never physically reached, describing successful de-escalation work with a patient who requires crisis intervention that transcends the normal boundaries between emergency and resolution. Some psychiatric emergency response continues indefinitely, ensuring that crisis intervention services remain available for emergencies that exist outside conventional time parameters. My final radio transmission is time-stamped at exactly 14:37, reporting successful crisis resolution and return to service, though I suspect Unit 47 will continue responding to this same emergency call long after I have transferred to other duties, providing psychiatric crisis intervention that extends across shifts, across years, across the eternal need for emergency response when mental illness intersects with public safety. As I pushed my cleaning cart down the third-floor corridor at 2:47 a.m., I realized I was servicing room 312B, which, according to the hospital's architectural plans, was a solid wall. Yet I had just spent 20 minutes cleaning what was clearly a patient room, occupied by someone who needed their space maintained, with the same dignity I provided to every other area of the psychiatric unit. My name is Robert Anderson, and for 30 years I have worked the night shift as head custodian for the psychiatric unit at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Custodial work in a psychiatric facility requires understanding that cleanliness serves therapeutic as well as practical purposes. Every room, every hallway, every common area must be maintained not just for hygiene, but to provide the environmental dignity that supports healing and recovery. The psychiatric unit custodial responsibilities extend far beyond typical hospital cleaning. Mental health treatment requires spaces that feel safe, respectful, and hopeful rather than clinical and institutional. My work involves maintaining environments that support psychological healing, ensuring that patients and families encounter spaces that communicate care, attention, and respect for human dignity during their most vulnerable moments. My custodial rounds begin at 11 p.m. and conclude at 7 a.m., covering every area of the psychiatric unit during hours when patient treatment activities are minimal. The night shift allows thorough cleaning without disrupting therapy sessions, medical procedures, or family visits. My master keys provide access to all areas of the unit, enabling comprehensive maintenance that ensures morning staff and patients encounter spaces that are clean, organized, and ready for the day's healing work. The cleaning equipment I use has been carefully selected for psychiatric environments. Chemical-free cleaning products reduce environmental sensitivities that can exacerbate mental health conditions. Quiet equipment minimizes disruption to patients who may be experiencing sleep difficulties or sound sensitivity. Every tool and technique is chosen to support rather than interfere with the therapeutic environment. 6 months ago, I began noticing that my custodial rounds were extending beyond the official boundaries of the psychiatric unit. My cleaning cart would guide me to areas that didn't appear on architectural plans, rooms that required the same thorough maintenance as officially designated patient spaces, yet existed in parts of the building that should have been solid walls or mechanical spaces. The first impossible room I serviced was 312B, located between rooms 312 and 313 on the third floor. According to building schematics, this space housed electrical and plumbing infrastructure. Yet when I arrived with my cleaning cart, I found a patient room requiring full custodial services, floor mopping, surface disinfection, bed linen replacement, and bathroom maintenance. Initially, I assumed these impossible rooms represented construction modifications that hadn't been updated in architectural documentation. Hospitals frequently undergo renovations that create new spaces before administrative systems are updated to reflect physical changes. I continued providing custodial services while planning to report the discrepancy to building maintenance. However, as weeks passed, the impossible rooms multiplied and became increasingly disconnected from the building's physical structure. I found patient rooms in basement areas that should have been mechanical spaces, therapy rooms on floors that didn't exist according to elevator controls, and common areas in locations that defied the hospital's architectural geometry. Each impossible room required the same careful custodial attention as officially designated spaces. Patients were clearly using these areas. Beds showed signs of occupancy, bathrooms required cleaning, and personal items were arranged on surfaces that needed dusting and organization. The rooms served active therapeutic functions, despite existing outside conventional physical boundaries. The breakthrough came when I realized that the impossible rooms were appearing in response to specific custodial needs that transcended official space allocations. Room 312B manifested when a patient required private space that wasn't available within the unit's official capacity. Other impossible rooms provided therapeutic environments for activities that couldn't be accommodated within conventional architectural limitations. Began documenting these impossible spaces with the same attention I applied to official custodial duties. Each impossible room received thorough cleaning, appropriate maintenance, and careful attention to the environmental details that support psychological healing. The spaces were serving real therapeutic functions for individuals who needed them, regardless of their official existence status. As I researched the history of custodial work at Millbrook, I discovered that impossible rooms had been serviced by night shift custodians for decades. Previous custodians had documented the same phenomenon, spaces that existed only when needed, requiring maintenance that supported therapeutic functions beyond official architectural boundaries. The pattern revealed that custodial work at Millbrook extended beyond maintaining existing spaces to include creating and servicing environments that manifested in response to psychological need. The impossible rooms represented the custodial profession's ultimate purpose, ensuring that healing spaces exist wherever they are needed, regardless of architectural limitations or administrative recognition. I realized that some custodial work transcends physical building maintenance to include environmental support for therapeutic needs that exceed conventional space allocation. The impossible rooms required custodian who understood that cleaning services sometimes extend beyond official floor plans to serve healing requirements that manifest in spaces created by desperate need for dignity and care. Tonight marks my final shift before retirement. I have prepared detailed instructions for my replacement, though I suspect the impossible rooms will train them more thoroughly than my documentation ever could. The cleaning cart will continue to guide custodians to spaces that need maintenance, whether they appear on architectural plans or exist only in the realm of therapeutic necessity. My final custodial round includes 37 official rooms and 23 impossible spaces, all requiring the same careful attention to environmental dignity. The psychiatric unit will continue to expand beyond its architectural boundaries whenever patients need spaces for healing. And some custodians will continue to maintain the impossible rooms that provide therapeutic environments for psychological needs that transcend conventional building design. As I hang up my keys for the final time, I understand that custodial work at Millbrook serves purposes beyond physical maintenance. Some cleaning preserves not just spaces, but the possibility that healing environments will always exist for those who need them most desperately, regardless of architectural limitations or official space allocation.